Not asking. I'm telling you. Move this bus, or I will remove you from it.
My patient's life is my responsibility. That is my oath. I will not move this ambulance.
You just made a very big mistake.
The air inside Ambulance 74 was thick with the metallic scent of saline and the low, urgent hum of the cardiac monitor. Outside, the midday sun beat down on the asphalt of downtown Charleston. But inside this small, refrigerated world, Ben Carter was fighting a war against time. His patient, a construction worker named Frank, was a roadmap of distress. His skin was pale and clammy, his lips were tinged with blue, and the monitor above his head was spitting out a rhythm that was fast becoming a chaotic scribble. Severe dehydration, tipping into heat stroke. Every drop of IV fluid Ben administered was a single soldier sent to defend a crumbling fortress. Heart rate still erratic. Pushing another 500 cubic centimeters bolus, Ben said, his voice a calm, practiced metronome against the rising panic of the machines. His partner, Maria Sanchez, a 10-year veteran with eyes that had seen everything, adjusted the oxygen mask on Frank's face. She didn't need to say anything. They had worked together long enough to communicate through glances and the subtle shift of their weight. They were a team, a well-oiled machine dedicated to pulling people back from the edge. Right now. Frank was dangling over that edge by a thread. Ben was in his element. At 36, with 12 years on the job, he moved with an economy of motion that was almost beautiful. Every action had a purpose. From the precise way he tore the medical tape to the gentle but firm pressure he used to check for a pulse. This was his office, his sanctuary. In here, there was only the patient, the protocol, and the problem to be solved. The world outside, with its noise and its politics, faded away. That's when the knock came. Not a polite rap, but a hard, percussive thud against the ambulance's rear door. It was the kind of knock that didn't ask for permission. It demanded entry. Ben didn't even look up. "Maria, can you see who that is? We're a little busy back here." Maria peered through the small, tinted window, her shoulders tensed. "It's CPD, one officer, and he does not look happy." The knock came again, harder this time, rattling the door in its frame. "Ambulance 74, open this door now!" The voice was muffled, but laced with an unmistakable edge of command. Ben's focus remained on his patient's IV line. "Tell him we're with a critical patient. We'll be clear as soon as we're stabilized for transport." That was the standard response. The universal language between first responders. A critical patient trumped everything: traffic, inconvenience, everything. It was a sacred rule. Maria unlatched the door and opened it a crack, a wall of humid city air flooding the cool interior. A young officer stood there, face flushed red under his cap, his jaw tight with irritation. His name tag read D. Miller. He was maybe 28, with the kind of rigid posture that suggested he was more invested in the authority of his uniform than the duty it represented. "You need to move this vehicle. Now," Officer Miller snapped, his eyes darting past Maria to the scene inside. "We're in the middle of a critical intervention. Officer," Maria said, her tone firm but respectful. "My partner is trying to stabilize a patient for transport. We can't move." Miller's gaze was dismissive. He didn't seem to register the beeping monitors or the man fighting for his life on the gurney. He saw only an obstacle. "I don't think you understand. There's a VIP motorcade coming through. This entire street needs to be cleared 5 minutes ago. I'm not asking. I'm telling you, move this bus." Ben finally looked up, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He had dealt with arrogant cops before, but this was a new level of obliviousness. He made eye contact with Miller over Maria's shoulder. "Sir, This man is in cardiac distress due to severe heat stroke. His pressure is bottoming out. If I move this vehicle, the jostling alone could send him into full cardiac arrest. We are not moving until he is stable. That is the law, and that is our protocol." Miller's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, crowding Maria. "Your protocol doesn't override a direct order from a police officer securing a route. You're obstructing a police operation." A faint, incredulous laugh escaped Ben's lips. "Obstructing? Officer? I'm doing my job. I'm saving a man's life. You should try it sometime. Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to get back to it." He turned his attention back to Frank. A clear dismissal. He could feel the temperature in the air change. It wasn't just the heat from outside anymore. It was the cold fury radiating from Officer Miller. He heard Maria take a half step back as Miller pushed the door fully open. Stepping up onto the rear bumper, "I'm not going to tell you again." Miller's voice was low, almost a growl. "Get in the driver's seat and move this ambulance, or I will move it for you." Ben didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a clash of wills on a sun-baked street. Officer Dean Miller, a 28-year-old cop with 3 years on the force and a sealed file of citizen complaints about his aggressive tactics, had just made a decision. He had looked at a man saving another's life and seen nothing but an insult to his authority. What Miller didn't know was that a German tourist across the street, annoyed by the commotion, had just lifted his smartphone. He didn't know that his own body camera was recording every petulant word, and he certainly didn't know that his next action would not only end his career, but would also trigger a firestorm that would engulf the entire city administration and result in a multi-million-dollar reckoning. Ben Carter was a man who understood pressure. He had delivered babies in the back of moving ambulances, performed CPR on children while their parents screamed, and held the hands of dying men who had run out of time. In every situation, the key was to block out the noise and focus on the one thing that mattered: the patient. Now, standing on the back bumper of his own ambulance, Officer Dean Miller had become the noise. "Officer, with all due respect, you are interfering with a medical emergency," Ben said, his voice dropping into the calm, authoritative tone he used when taking control of a chaotic scene. He stood up, placing himself squarely between Miller and his patient. He was taller than the officer, with the solid build of a man who spent his days lifting people, but his posture was non-threatening. "I am the senior paramedic on this scene. Medical authority rests with me. You are not trained to assess this patient's condition, and your presence here is a distraction. I need you to step back and allow us to do our work." Miller's face, already flushed from the heat, darkened to a deep crimson. It was a clear challenge to his authority, delivered in front of Maria and the handful of onlookers who were now starting to gather on the sidewalk. Among them was Klaus Richter, the German tourist. His phone held steady, its lens capturing the tableau, the desperate medical scene inside the ambulance and the rigid, uniformed figure blocking the doorway. "Your medical authority ends where my lawful order begins," Miller shot back, his hand instinctively dropping to rest on the handle of his service weapon, a gesture of casual intimidation that didn't go unnoticed. "You are obstructing. That is a crime. I'm giving you one final chance to comply. Move the vehicle." Behind him, Miller's partner, a weary-looking officer named Kowalski, stepped out of their patrol car. Kowalski was 35, 10 years on the force, and had learned long ago that the path of least resistance was to let Dean Miller run his mouth. Challenging him only made things worse. He watched the scene unfold with a practiced sense of detachment, a silent accomplice to the brewing disaster. Maria Sanchez saw the situation escalating. She knew the type. Cops like Miller saw the world in black and white, compliance and non-compliance, Nuance was a weakness. "Officer, please," she said, trying a softer approach. "We'll be out of here in 5 minutes, 10 at the most. Just give us a few more minutes to get him stable. That's all we're asking." Miller ignored her completely. His eyes were locked on Ben. "You think that little patch on your sleeve makes you special? You're a glorified taxi driver. Now, are you going to move this ambulance, or am I going to have to remove you from it?" The insult was designed to provoke, to push Ben off balance, but Ben had been called worse by people in far more distress. He didn't flinch. "I am a paramedic, and I took an oath to do no harm. Moving this patient right now would be a direct violation of that oath. It could kill him. My answer is no. I will not move this ambulance." That was it. The line had been drawn. It wasn't just a line on the asphalt. It was a line between duty and ego, between saving a life and asserting control. For Ben, the choice was simple. His entire career, his entire moral compass pointed in one direction. For Officer Miller, Ben's refusal was an intolerable act of defiance. It wasn't about the motorcade anymore. He probably hadn't even thought about the VIP in 10 minutes. It was about a paramedic telling him no. Miller stepped fully into the ambulance, forcing Maria to move aside. He was now just inches from Ben, his voice a low, menacing hiss. "You just made a very big mistake." "No, officer," Ben replied, his gaze unwavering. "You are—" What Miller didn't understand was the sheer weight of the system he was trying to bully. He didn't know that ambulance dispatch logs were time-stamped to the second, documenting their arrival and the critical nature of the call. He didn't know that the patient's vitals, currently being transmitted in real time to the emergency room, were creating an irrefutable medical record of his life-threatening condition. He didn't know that the Charleston Fire Department's protocols on patient transport were written in stone and legally binding, and he didn't know that in a court of law. The sworn oath of a paramedic to preserve life would carry far more weight than a police officer's desire to clear a traffic lane. Miller reached for Ben's arm. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice." Kowalski, watching from the street, finally seemed to realize this was going too far. He took a step forward. "Dean, maybe we should just call a supervisor." But it was too late. Miller's ego was in the driver's seat now. He had committed, and he would not back down. The camera across the street kept rolling, capturing the precise moment a police officer decided his pride was more important than a man's life. The moment Officer Miller's hand clamped down on his arm. Ben Carter's world narrowed to a few critical certainties. The first was the patient. Frank's heart monitor was beeping a frantic, desperate rhythm. The second was Maria, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The third was the hard, unyielding grip of the officer, a man so consumed by his own authority that he was willing to risk a man's life to prove a point. "You can't be serious," Ben said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and astonishment. He didn't pull away, knowing that would be twisted into resisting arrest. He stood his ground, a living statue of defiance. "There is a dying man right here. You are abandoning your duty to protect and serve." "My duty is to maintain order," Miller sneered, his fingers digging into Ben's bicep. He began to pull Ben toward the open doors of the ambulance. "And you are the source of the disorder." Maria rushed forward. "Stop! You can't take him! I need him! The patient is decompensating!" Frank's blood pressure alarm began to blare, a high-pitched shriek that cut through the city noise. It was a scream for help that Miller chose to ignore. "Stay back, or you'll be next," Miller warned her, never taking his eyes off Ben. He yanked Ben harder, pulling him off balance. Ben stumbled backward, out of the cool sanctuary of the ambulance and into the oppressive heat of the street. The sudden shift was jarring. The sun was blinding. Miller twisted Ben's arm behind his back with a practiced, painful efficiency. The motion was unnecessarily violent, designed to inflict pain and ensure compliance. Ben gritted his teeth, the cartilage in his shoulder screaming in protest, across the street. Klaus Richter zoomed in with his phone. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. In his home country of Germany, such a scene would be unthinkable. A paramedic being arrested while actively treating a patient? It was madness. He kept recording, his hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from a profound sense of outrage. "Turn around and face the vehicle," Miller commanded, shoving Ben against the side of the ambulance. The hot metal burned through the fabric of Ben's uniform. "I am not resisting," Ben said through clenched teeth, focusing on his breathing, trying to stay calm. He knew the importance of his own words, his own actions. Everything would be scrutinized later. Miller forced Ben's hands behind his back, and the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the street. They were ratcheted on tight, biting into the flesh of his wrists. From the corner of his eye, Ben could see Miller's partner, Kowalski, standing frozen, his face a mask of conflict and resignation. He was doing nothing. He was letting it happen. "What's the charge?" Ben demanded, his voice strained. "Obstruction of justice. Failure to obey a lawful order. Take your pick," Miller said, patting him down with a rough, dismissive motion. From inside the ambulance came Maria's desperate voice. "I need help in here. His pressure is 60/40. I'm losing him. Somebody, call a supervisor." The plea hung in the hot air. A few onlookers gasped. One person shouted, "Hey, leave him alone. He's a paramedic." Miller ignored them all. He was in his own world, a world where he had won. He turned to Kowalski. "Put him in the back of the car," as Kowalski finally moved, taking Ben by the arm to lead him away. Ben twisted his head to look back at the ambulance, at the open door where Maria was now frantically working alone, her movements a blur of controlled panic. He saw the patient's hand fall limply off the side of the gurney. It was a small, devastating detail. He had been ripped away from his post, from his duty, from a man who was depending on him. The feeling of helplessness was a physical weight, heavier than the officer's hands, heavier than the shame of being paraded in handcuffs. What Officer Miller didn't see was the network of invisible threads he had just snapped. He didn't understand that every first responder in the city, police, fire, EMS, operated on a delicate foundation of mutual trust and respect. By putting his hands on a paramedic in the middle of a call, he had shattered that trust. He didn't know that the Charleston fire chief and the police chief played golf together every other Thursday, and that an act like this was not just an attack on an EMT, but a profound insult to an entire department. He didn't know that the video of this moment, of a uniformed hero being cuffed while alarms blared from his ambulance, was about to be uploaded to a server, where it would be copied, shared, and mirrored 1,000 times before he even finished his paperwork. He had just arrested one man, but he had declared war on an entire system, and that system was about to bring its full, crushing weight down upon him. Just as Kowalski was guiding Ben toward the patrol car, the screech of tires announced a new player on the scene. A police SUV, driven with urgency but not recklessness, pulled up behind the ambulance. The door flew open, and Sergeant Eva Rostova emerged, her expression already a mask of grim determination. Rostova was in her late 40s, a 20-year veteran who had earned her stripes on the street, not behind a desk. She carried an air of no-nonsense authority that came not from her rank, but from a deep well of competence and experience. The dispatch call had been garbled but urgent. An officer-involved conflict with EMS, a critical patient, a request for a supervisor. That was all she needed to hear. Her eyes took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The ambulance with its door agape and alarms shrieking. Maria Sanchez working frantically inside, the crowd of stunned onlookers with their phones held high, and two of her own officers leading a handcuffed paramedic away from the crisis. Her gaze hardened. This was wrong. This was a tactical and ethical nightmare. "Miller! Kowalski! What the hell is going on here?" Rostova's voice wasn't a shout, but it cut through the air with the sharp authority of a cracking whip. Officer Miller turned, a flash of annoyance crossing his face before being replaced by a defensive swagger. "Sarge, glad you're here. This paramedic was refusing a direct order to clear the road for the senator's motorcade. He was obstructing, so I placed him under arrest." He said it with a finality that suggested the matter was closed, the situation handled. Rostova's eyes narrowed to slits. She ignored Miller and walked directly to the back of the ambulance, her focus shifting entirely to the real emergency. "Ma'am, what's your patient's status?" she asked Maria. Maria looked up, her face streaked with sweat, her relief palpable. "Sergeant, thank God. He's in VTASH. Blood pressure is crashing. I needed my partner's help to administer an amiodarone drip, and now I'm trying to do it alone. He needs to get to the hospital now." Rostova didn't hesitate. Her priorities were clear. Life first. Everything else second. She turned back to her officers, and the full force of her command presence descended upon them. "Miller, what part of a medical emergency did you fail to understand? Get those cuffs off him, now!" Miller was stunned into momentary silence. He had expected backup, not a public reprimand. "But Sarge, he disobeyed a lawful—" "I don't give a damn about the motorcade," Rostova snapped, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "That patient dies. It's not just on your conscience. It's on this whole department. This incident is now a potential death in custody investigation, and you are the primary actor. Do you understand the gravity of what you've just done? Get the cuffs off him." The finality in her voice finally broke through Miller's arrogant haze. The mention of a death in custody investigation was a bucket of ice water. That was career-ending language. Kowalski, looking relieved to be given a clear, sane order, fumbled for his cuff key. Miller, however, still tried to save face. "My report will reflect his non-compliance." "Your report will reflect whatever you want," Rostova said, turning her back on him dismissively. "But the body cameras and the 20 cell phone cameras pointed at us will reflect the truth. Uncuff him, Kowalski." With a click, Ben's hands were free. Deep red welts circled his wrists. He didn't say a word to the officers. He didn't even look at them. He immediately turned and climbed back into the ambulance, his focus snapping back to his patient. "What do you need?" he asked Maria, seamlessly re-entering the rhythm of their work. "Amiodarone, 300 milligrams, fast push. Get ready for synchronized cardioversion if this doesn't work." Rostova stood at the back of the ambulance, watching them work, her face a mixture of respect for the paramedics and cold fury for her own officer. She keyed her radio, her voice level and professional, betraying none of the chaos of the scene. "Dispatch, this is Sergeant Rostova. Be advised, Ambulance 74 is preparing for immediate transport of a critical patient. Give them a full police escort to University Hospital, and have the watch commander meet me at this location, immediately." She then turned to Miller and Kowalski, who were standing awkwardly by their patrol car. "You two, do not leave. Do not talk to each other. Your body cameras will continue to record. We are going to have a very long, very detailed conversation when this is over." What Sergeant Rostova didn't know at that moment was that the situation was already far beyond her control. While she was competently managing the scene on the ground, the digital fuse had been lit. Across the street, Klaus Richter had stopped recording. He looked down at the 10-minute video file on his phone. It was clear. The audio was crisp, and the injustice it depicted was undeniable. He tapped a few buttons, connected to the airport's public Wi-Fi, and uploaded the video to his social media page with a simple, damning caption in English. In America, police arrest the paramedic for trying to save a life. Unbelievable. That small act, performed by a stranger hundreds of miles from home, was about to do what Sergeant Rostova's report never could. It was about to make the incident a global spectacle. While Ben and Maria raced toward University Hospital, their patient finally stabilized, thanks to the police escort clearing a path. The video of the arrest was beginning its silent, exponential journey across the internet. Klaus Richter's post, initially shared with a few hundred friends and followers, was quickly picked up by a local activist group in Charleston. From there, it jumped to a national news aggregator, then to the feeds of several high-profile journalists. The algorithm, designed to detect and promote content with high engagement, shock, anger, disbelief, did its work with brutal efficiency. Within 45 minutes, the video had 100,000 views. The title had been rephrased by others into something more potent. Hero EMT arrested for saving a life while cop worries about a politician's commute. Police Chief Frank Donovan was in a budget meeting, arguing about overtime pay for the K-9 unit, when his phone started vibrating on the table. It was the department's public information officer. Donovan ignored it. A minute later, it buzzed again, then again. Exasperated, he excused himself and took the call in the hallway. "Chief, you need to see this. It's bad," the PIO said. His voice strained. He sent a link. Donovan opened it. He watched the 10-minute video in its entirety, his face growing paler with each passing second. He saw his officer, Miller, escalate a simple traffic request into a full-blown physical confrontation. He heard Miller's arrogant, dismissive tone. He saw the handcuffs click onto the paramedic's wrists while medical alarms shrieked from the ambulance. He saw his other officer, Kowalski, stand by and do nothing. Finally, he saw Sergeant Rostova arrive and take control, her professionalism a stark contrast to Miller's reckless aggression. But the damage was done. 10 minutes of video had just undone years of community outreach and public relations efforts. "Get me Rostova's preliminary report. Pull Miller's and Kowalski's body camera footage. Now," Donovan ordered, his voice dangerously quiet. "And get their service records on my desk. I want to see every complaint, every commendation, every mark on their jackets." He hung up and immediately dialed the mayor's office. "We have a problem," he began. "A very big, very public problem," simultaneously across town. Fire Chief Michael Riley was returning from a luncheon when his own phone began to light up. It was the head of the paramedics union. "Chief, have you seen the video? One of our guys, Ben Carter, a good man, was just assaulted and unlawfully arrested by a CPD officer on a critical call." Riley, a former paramedic himself, felt a surge of protective fury. He found the video online. The view count was now approaching 500,000. He watched Ben, a man he had personally commended for his work during a multi-car pileup last year, being manhandled for doing his job. He heard the insult, "Glorified taxi driver." It was a slap in the face to every man and woman in his department. He called Chief Donovan. The line was busy. He tried again. Still busy. He then called Donovan's direct assistant. "Tell the chief I'm on my way to his office, and he and I are going to have a talk about Officer Dean Miller. And tell him to bring his checkbook, because this city is about to be sued into the next century." What neither chief knew was that the story had already taken on a life of its own. It was the #1 trending topic on Twitter. News outlets from CNN to Fox News were downloading the footage and preparing segments for their evening broadcasts. Legal experts were being called for commentary on obstruction versus medical duty to act laws. The video, stripped of its original context, had become a perfect, self-contained narrative of injustice. A dedicated public servant being crushed by an arrogant, power-tripping cop. In his office, Officer Dean Miller was just beginning to write his incident report. In his version of events, he was the calm professional, and the paramedic was an agitated, uncooperative subject who posed a threat to the safety of the motorcade. He wrote that he used standard techniques to effect a necessary arrest. He was confident that his word, the word of a police officer, would stand against that of an emotional EMT. He had no idea that millions of people were, at that very moment, watching him lie. He didn't know that every word he typed into his report was already being contradicted by a video that was playing on a loop in the mayor's office, in the fire chief's office, and in the newsrooms of every major media outlet in the country. He was building a house of cards on ground that was already shaking from the force of an earthquake he himself had triggered. By the time the evening news cycle began, the story of Ben Carter's arrest was no longer a local issue. It had become a national symbol of everything wrong with modern policing. The video was everywhere, dissected frame by frame on cable news. The image of Ben in handcuffs, with the ambulance in the background, was on the front page of news websites across the country. The city of Charleston, once known for its historic charm, was now the center of a raging debate about abuse of power. The mayor's office, caught completely off guard, scrambled to do damage control. A hastily arranged press conference was called. Mayor Thompson, a man more comfortable cutting ribbons than handling crises, stood at a podium and read a prepared statement. "The events that transpired earlier today are deeply concerning," he said, his voice betraying his anxiety. "I want to assure the public that we are taking this matter with the utmost seriousness. Officer Dean Miller has been placed on administrative leave pending a full and thorough investigation by the Office of Internal Affairs." It was the standard bureaucratic response, and it did nothing to quell the public's anger. The press conference devolved into a shouting match as reporters barraged the mayor and Police Chief Donovan with questions. "Chief, is it standard procedure to arrest a paramedic for saving a patient's life? Does Officer Miller have a history of complaints? Will the city be issuing an apology to Mr. Carter and the fire department?" Chief Donovan, stone-faced, stepped to the microphone. The actions depicted in the video are not representative of the training and values of the Charleston Police Department. We will investigate this incident thoroughly, and we will be transparent with our findings. I have personally reached out to Fire Chief Riley to express my profound regret over this incident. Behind the scenes, however, a frantic search was underway. The chief's order to pull Miller's service record had yielded a disturbing pattern. In his 3 years on the force, Officer Miller had accumulated 6 citizen complaints for excessive force and verbal abuse. All 6 had been investigated at a supervisory level and dismissed as unfounded or subject unsubstantiated. No formal discipline had ever been administered. The complaints had been quietly buried in his file, a series of red flags that had been deliberately ignored. The supervisors who had cleared him were now being scrutinized themselves. The blue wall of silence had protected Miller before, but now, under the glare of a national spotlight, that wall was beginning to crumble. Meanwhile, Ben Carter was at home, trying to process the day's events. He had given his official statement to his fire department superiors and the union representative. His wrists were bruised, and his shoulder ached, but the deeper injury was to his spirit. He had been treated like a criminal for upholding the oath he had sworn to protect. His phone hadn't stopped ringing, with calls from family, friends, and reporters. He ignored them all. sitting in silence as he watched his own arrest play out on the evening news. It was a surreal, out-of-body experience. What Ben didn't know was that his case had attracted the attention of people in very high places. A civil rights organization had already contacted a top law firm in the state. The video had been forwarded to the state's Attorney General's office. Even the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had been unofficially alerted. The incident was no longer just about Officer Miller. It was about a pattern of behavior, a failure of supervision, and a culture that allowed an officer like him to operate with impunity. Back at police headquarters, the internal affairs investigators were watching the body camera footage from Miller and Kowalski. It was even more damning than the tourists' video. The audio was clearer. It captured Miller's initial aggressive approach. It recorded his dismissive comments to Maria Sanchez. It caught his inflammatory insult. Glorified taxi driver. Most critically, it recorded Kowalski's hesitant suggestion to call a supervisor, a suggestion Miller had arrogantly brushed aside. The lead investigator paused the video and looked at his partner. He had an out, the investigator said quietly. Kowalski gave him a chance to de-escalate, and he chose not to. He chose to go physical. That's not a mistake in judgment, that's a conscious decision. Officer Miller, sitting at home on administrative leave, believed he was the victim of a media witch hunt. He was convinced that the internal affairs investigation would be a mere formality, that his supervisors would stand by him, and that this whole thing would eventually blow over. He didn't understand that the ground had fundamentally shifted beneath his feet. The buried complaints, once his shield, were about to become the prosecution's evidence. The system that had protected him was now preparing to sacrifice him to save itself. The internal affairs interview room was a small, windowless box painted a sterile shade of beige. It was designed to be uncomfortable, to strip away confidence and encourage compliance. Officer Dean Miller sat at one side of a metal table, trying to project an aura of wronged confidence. Across from him sat Lieutenant Harding, the head of IA, a man with a reputation for being methodical, unflappable, and utterly immune to the unwritten rules of the blue wall. Officer Miller, let's start from the beginning, Harding said, his voice neutral. Walk me through your interaction with the EMS crew. Miller launched into the version of the story he had rehearsed, the same one he had written in his now impounded incident report. I approached the ambulance and gave a lawful order to clear the street for a priority motorcade. The senior paramedic, Carter, immediately became agitated and belligerent. He refused to comply and used aggressive language. I perceived his posture and tone as a potential threat to officer safety. Harding just listened, his pen making slow, deliberate notes on a yellow legal pad. He let Miller talk for a full 10 minutes, allowing him to build his narrative, to lay the foundation of his own defense. Miller described Ben as unhinged and claimed he had to make a split-second decision to arrest him before the situation escalated further. So, in your professional judgment, the paramedic was the primary source of the aggression? Harding asked, his expression unreadable. Absolutely, Miller said with conviction. I acted with restraint. I used the minimum amount of force necessary to effect the arrest and restore order. Harding nodded slowly. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. That's a very clear and detailed account. Officer, the problem is, it doesn't match the evidence. He turned to a monitor on a cart next to the table and pressed a button on a remote. The screen flickered to life, showing the view from Miller's own body camera. The audio was crystal clear. You need to move this vehicle now. Miller's voice from the speaker was sharp, impatient. The video played on. It showed Ben Carter's calm, professional explanation of the patient's condition. It showed Maria Sanchez's polite request for a few more minutes. There was no belligerence, no aggression. There was only a medical team doing its job. Then came the audio of Miller's insult. "You think that little patch on your sleeve makes you special? You're a glorified taxi driver." Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The confident facade was beginning to crack. Harding paused the video. Does that sound like an officer attempting to de-escalate a situation, or does it sound like an officer trying to provoke one? "You have to understand the context," Miller began. But Harding cut him off. "I understand the context perfectly, and the context is right here, recorded by your own camera." He pressed play again. The video showed Miller ignoring Kowalski's suggestion to call a supervisor. It showed him initiating physical contact, grabbing Ben's arm without provocation. Harding froze the frame at the exact moment Miller's hand made contact. "Right there. Officer. That's the moment you escalated this from a verbal disagreement to a physical assault. The paramedic was not advancing on you. His hands were visible. He posed no physical threat. Please, explain to me the justification for that use of force." Miller's face was now slick with sweat. The rehearsed lines were gone, replaced by a desperate scramble for justification. He was tensing up. "I thought he was going to fight." "He was tensing up because you were invading his space and threatening to arrest him for doing his job," Harding stated flatly. "We also have Officer Kowalski's statement." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a summary of Kowalski's IA interview. Kowalski, facing the end of his career and potential criminal charges for filing a false report, had told the truth. He had stated that Ben Carter was professional and non-threatening, and that he believed Miller's actions were unnecessary and overly aggressive. The blue wall had not just cracked, it had been demolished. Miller's own partner had turned on him. "Kowalski is just trying to save his own skin," Miller muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "And you're not?" Harding countered. "Officer Miller, you lied in your official report. You lied to me just now. You abused your authority. You abandoned a man in medical distress. You assaulted another first responder. And you have brought disgrace upon this department. Your version of events is a work of fiction. The reality is that you lost your temper because a paramedic told you no, and you couldn't handle it." Harding stood up, the interview clearly over. "You are hereby suspended without pay. I am recommending your immediate termination to the chief and forwarding this entire case file to the district attorney's office for review of criminal charges, including assault, battery, and official misconduct." As Miller was escorted out of the room, his career in ruins, he still didn't grasp the full scope of his downfall. He thought this was the end, the worst of it. What he didn't realize was that internal affairs was just the first wave. The legal tsunami was still gathering force offshore. The civil lawsuit, backed by the viral video, the body camera footage, and now his partner's testimony, was coming, and it would be far more public and far more costly than anything he had ever imagined. The VIP at the center of the controversy, State Senator Marcus Thorne, had been in a closed-door legislative caucus when the story broke. He emerged to a barrage of texts and missed calls. His communications director met him in the hallway, her face ashen. "Senator, we have a major problem." She showed him the video on her tablet. Thorne, a slick, media-savvy politician in his 50s, watched the footage of Officer Miller arresting Ben Carter. He didn't see a police officer clearing a path for him. He saw a political anchor being tied around his ankles. His motorcade, his name, was now inextricably linked to a national scandal involving police brutality. "Who is this officer?" Thorne demanded. "Did he say he was acting on my orders?" "No. He just referenced a VIP motorcade," the director replied, "but the media has already connected it to your publicly scheduled appearance downtown. We're getting calls from every major news network." Thorne knew exactly what he had to do. In politics, proximity to a scandal is death. The only survival instinct is to create distance, immediately and decisively. He spent the next 20 minutes crafting a public statement with his team. It was a masterpiece of political maneuvering. He held an impromptu press conference on the steps of the State House less than an hour later. I have just been made aware of the deeply disturbing video involving an officer and a paramedic in Charleston, Thorne began, his face a mask of solemn concern. Let me be unequivocally clear. The actions of that officer were appalling and unacceptable. A first responder's duty to a patient is sacred and must never be interfered with. I was not aware of this officer's actions, and had I been, I would have ordered my convoy to a full stop and demanded he allow the paramedic to do his job. He was brilliant. In one swift move, he had transformed himself from the cause of the problem into a righteous critic of it. He positioned himself as an ally of Ben Carter, a champion of first responders. I have reached out to the offices of the mayor and the police chief to express my profound disappointment, he continued. Furthermore, I am calling for a full investigation by the State Department of Justice into the training and supervision protocols of the Charleston Police Department to ensure that an incident like this never, ever happens again. With that, he had not only saved himself, but had also thrown the entire city administration under the bus. He had insulated himself from any legal or political liability, leaving the city of Charleston to face the consequences alone. The city's legal department was in chaos. The mayor was furious, feeling betrayed by the senator's public condemnation. The city attorneys knew that Thorne's statement had just dramatically weakened their position. They had lost a powerful potential ally and gained a powerful public critic. Any hope of framing this as a necessary police action for a state official's security was now gone. The city's lead attorney, a man named Gerald Finney, sat in his office with Police Chief Donovan. The viral video played on a loop on his computer screen, the sound muted. "This is a catastrophe," Finney said, rubbing his temples. "We have no defense. The officer's actions are indefensible. His own body camera convicts him. His partner is a cooperating witness for the prosecution. And now the politician he was supposedly clearing the road for has publicly crucified him and us along with him." "So we settle," Donovan said grimly. "We cut our losses and make this go away as quietly as possible." "There's no such thing as quietly anymore," Finney retorted. "This is the biggest news story in the country. Ben Carter and his lawyer, whoever they hire, will have all the leverage. They can name their price. And because of the gross negligence involved, our municipal insurance carrier is already making noises about refusing to cover the damages, claiming Miller's actions were so far outside the bounds of his training that they constitute willful misconduct. This was the ultimate nightmare for the city. Not only were they facing a massive lawsuit, but they might have to pay for it directly out of the city's budget, meaning cuts to parks, sanitation, and public services. What Gerald Finney didn't know was that the situation was about to get even worse. In a law office across town, Ben Carter was sitting down with a man who wasn't just any lawyer. He was meeting with Marcus Thorne, no relation to the senator, a legendary civil rights attorney known as the Bulldog. Thorne had a reputation for taking on impossible cases against police departments and winning staggering, record-breaking verdicts. He didn't just want to settle, he wanted to go to trial. He wanted to put the entire department, its training, its culture of silence, and its history of ignoring complaints on public display. He wasn't just seeking compensation for Ben, he was seeking a reckoning for the city. The city's attorneys thought they were preparing for a negotiation. They were, in fact, preparing for a war they had already lost. The law offices of Thorne and Associates were not what Ben Carter had expected. He had pictured a modest, street-level operation. Instead, he found himself on the top floor of a downtown skyscraper, in a conference room with a panoramic view of the very city whose police department he was about to sue. The man who entered the room commanded it instantly. Marcus Thorne was in his early 60s, impeccably dressed, with a warm smile that did little to soften the piercing intelligence in his eyes. He had the calm, reassuring demeanor of a country doctor and the sharp, predatory instincts of a great white shark. "Mr. Carter, Ben, thank you for coming in," Thorne said, shaking his hand firmly. "I've seen the video. I've read the news reports, but I want to hear it from you. Tell me what happened." For the next hour, Ben recounted the entire ordeal, from the moment he heard the knock on the ambulance door to the moment the handcuffs were removed. He spoke with the precision of a trained first responder, focusing on facts, timelines, and the medical condition of his patient. He didn't embellish or editorialize. He didn't have to. The facts themselves were an indictment. Thorne listened intently, asking clarifying questions. "At any point did you raise your voice? At any point did you make a threatening gesture?" "No, sir," Ben said. "My only concern was for my patient. I was trained that in a medical emergency, the senior medical provider on scene has authority. I was upholding my training and my oath." "And Officer Miller's demeanor?" "It was aggressive from the start," Ben said. "He wasn't interested in a conversation. He was giving orders. When I explained the situation, he seemed to take it as a personal insult." When Ben finished, Thorne leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Ben, what the city will try to do is simple. They'll offer you a quick, quiet settlement. Something in the low 6 figures. They'll make you sign a non-disclosure agreement, and they'll admit no wrongdoing. They want this to go away. They want people to forget Officer Miller's name. And yours." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "But this isn't just about you, is it? This is about every paramedic who has ever been bullied by a cop on a power trip. This is about a system that ignored 6 prior complaints against this officer. A quiet settlement doesn't fix a broken system. A public trial does." Thorne stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "We're not just going to sue Officer Miller. We're going to sue the city of Charleston. We'll name Miller for assault and battery and unlawful arrest. We'll name the city for negligent hiring, negligent supervision, and for maintaining a policy and custom of indifference to police misconduct. We are going to put their entire operation on trial in front of a jury of their own citizens." A paralegal entered and handed Thorne a thick document. He placed it on the table in front of Ben. It was the official complaint, the first shot in the legal war. "The damages we are seeking will be substantial," Thorne said, his voice firm. "Not just to compensate you for the physical and emotional harm, but punitive damages. Damages designed to punish the city so severely that they will have no choice but to reform. We will demand body camera reforms, a civilian oversight board, and a complete overhaul of their internal affairs process." Ben looked at the legal document, his own name printed at the top. This was real. This was happening. "What are the chances we'll win?" Thorne smiled for the first time, a flash of predatory confidence. "Ben, they don't know it yet, but they've already lost. They handed us the perfect case. We have an unimpeachable plaintiff, a hero first responder. We have an arrogant, lying defendant. We have the entire event on high-definition video from multiple angles. We have the officer's own partner as a witness against him. In my 30 years of practicing law, I have never seen a stronger case." That afternoon, a courier delivered a copy of the lawsuit to the Charleston City Attorney's office. The amount listed in the section for punitive damages was not 6 figures. It was 8. The filing of the lawsuit was immediately picked up by the press. The story, which had been starting to fade, roared back to life. In his office, Gerald Finney, the city's lead attorney, read the complaint. He saw Marcus Thorne's name at the bottom and felt a pit form in his stomach. He knew Thorne's reputation. Thorne didn't bluff, and he didn't settle for pennies on the dollar. He took cases to trial and won verdicts that made headlines. Finney looked at the staggering sum being demanded and knew that his initial assessment was wrong. This wasn't a catastrophe. This was an extinction-level event for his city's finances and his department's reputation. The war had officially begun. The deposition of Officer Dean Miller took place 6 months later in a sterile, soulless conference room at a neutral law firm. Depositions are not trials. They are a pre-trial discovery tool where attorneys question potential witnesses under oath. There is no judge, no jury, just lawyers, a court reporter, and the witness. For Marcus Thorne, this was not just a fact-finding mission, it was a psychological battlefield where he intended to dismantle Officer Miller's credibility, piece by piece. Miller arrived with a city-appointed attorney, looking nervous but still projecting a defiant arrogance. He had been fired from the police department a month after the incident, but he was appealing the decision and still clung to the belief that he was the true victim. Marcus Thorne began gently, almost conversationally, asking Miller about his training, his years on the force, and his understanding of police procedures. Miller's answers were crisp and confident, filled with law enforcement jargon. Thorne was letting him build his own pedestal. "Officer Miller, let's talk about the day in question," Thorne said, his tone still mild. "In your incident report, you described EMT Carter as agitated and belligerent. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir. That is my recollection," Miller said firmly. "And you felt he posed a threat?" "In a tense, rapidly evolving situation, yes. His non-compliance created a safety issue." Thorne nodded, as if accepting the answer. He then gestured to a large monitor. "I'd like to play a video for you. This is from your own body camera." He played the first 30 seconds of the interaction. Ben Carter's voice was audible, calm and professional, explaining the patient's critical state. Thorne paused the video. "Officer, the man you hear speaking, Mr. Carter, does he sound agitated and belligerent to you?" Miller's city attorney interjected. "Objection. Calls for speculation on the witness's state of mind." "He can state what he hears," Thorne replied smoothly. "Officer, what do you hear?" Miller hesitated. "The video doesn't capture his body language, the tension in the air." "Let's talk about your language. Then," Thorne said, pressing play again. The infamous line filled the room. "You think that little patch on your sleeve makes you special? You're a glorified taxi driver." Thorne paused it again. "Officer, is that standard de-escalation language taught at the Charleston Police Academy? Is insulting another first responder part of your training?" "It was a high-stress situation," Miller stammered. "A situation you created," Thorne cut in, his voice hardening for the first time. "Let's move on. You stated that you used the minimum amount of force necessary. Is that right?" "Yes. Standard arrest procedure." Thorne played the next part of the video, Miller grabbing Ben's arm and wrenching it behind his back. He played it in slow motion. "Mr. Carter was not advancing on you, was he? He was not threatening you. Was he? His hands were at his sides, were they not?" With each question, Thorne was boxing him in. Miller's answers became clipped and defensive. "He was refusing a lawful order." "A paramedic's refusal to abandon a dying patient is not a lawful basis for assault." "Officer," Thorne said, his voice now dripping with contempt, "did you assess the patient's medical condition before ordering the ambulance to be moved?" "I'm not a doctor." "Precisely," Thorne thundered, slapping the table. "You are not a doctor! You are not a paramedic! You had no medical training. Yet you decided that your desire to clear traffic was more important than the expert medical judgment of a man trying to save a human life. Is that correct?" "Objection," the city attorney said weakly. Overruled in my mind, Thorne muttered. He looked directly at Miller. Let's talk about your report. You omitted your glorified taxi driver comment from your report, didn't you? Miller squirmed. I didn't think it was relevant. You didn't think a direct insult that showed your state of mind was relevant? Or did you deliberately omit it because you knew it made you look like a bully who lost his temper? Thorne pressed on, relentless. You also omitted the fact that your own partner, Officer Kowalski, suggested calling a supervisor, didn't you? I don't recall that specific detail. You don't recall it? Thorne feigned disbelief. Let me refresh your memory. He read from a transcript of Kowalski's deposition. I told Dean, maybe we should just call a supervisor. I felt the situation was getting out of hand. He ignored me. Thorne looked up. Does that refresh your memory? Officer Miller? Miller was cornered, his lies exposed by irrefutable evidence and the testimony of his own partner. He slumped in his chair, the arrogance finally draining out of him, replaced by the pale, clammy look of defeat. He muttered, I guess so. The deposition went on for another 2 hours, but it was already over. Marcus Thorne had masterfully used Miller's own words, his own video, and his own ego to utterly destroy him. He had not only secured the evidence he needed for trial, but he had also gotten a preview of the disastrous witness Miller would be in front of a jury. The court reporter's transcript of the deposition was a monument to Miller's lies and arrogance. It was a document that would make any settlement offer from the city skyrocket. What Miller and the city's lawyers didn't know was that Thorne had no intention of settling. This transcript wasn't a negotiating tool. It was the script for the closing argument he planned to deliver in court. Officer Frank Kowalski sat in his small, sparsely decorated living room, staring at a letter from the city's legal department. It informed him that he was a co-defendant in the Carter lawsuit. While Miller was the primary target, Kowalski was being sued for failure to intervene, a legal doctrine that held passive officers accountable for the actions of their partners. The letter also informed him that because his testimony to internal affairs contradicted Miller's, the city would provide him with separate legal counsel, a clear signal that they were cutting him loose to fend for himself. For months, Kowalski had been wrestling with his conscience. He had been on the force for 10 years, a quiet, unremarkable career spent trying to stay out of trouble. His partnership with Dean Miller had been a constant source of anxiety. He had witnessed Miller's short fuse and aggressive tactics on dozens of occasions, but had always stayed silent, telling himself it wasn't his place to question another officer's judgment. On that day, his silence had made him complicit in an injustice, and now it threatened to destroy his life. He had a wife, 2 kids, and a mortgage. The thought of losing his job, his pension, and being financially ruined by a lawsuit was a weight that was crushing him. His city-appointed lawyer had been blunt. Frank, your deposition is next week. You have 2 choices. You can lie to protect Miller, which would be perjury, a felony, and they'll crucify you in court with the body cam footage, or you can tell the truth, which will end your career in law enforcement but might save you from financial ruin and a criminal conviction. That's when the unexpected call came. It was from Marcus Thorne's office. Thorne wanted a meeting. Kowalski's lawyer was hesitant, but Thorne was insistent. It's not a deposition, Thorne's assistant had explained. It's an informal proffer session, off the record, a chance to talk. They met in the same neutral conference room where Miller had been deposed. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was no court reporter. It was just Thorne, Kowalski, and their respective lawyers. Frank, I'm not going to beat around the bush, Thorne began, his tone direct but not unkind. You're in a tough spot. You were partnered with a bad cop, and you stood by while he did a bad thing. The city is going to sacrifice you to try and mitigate their own damages. They will paint you as incompetent at best and a conspirator at worst. Kowalski just nodded, staring at the polished surface of the table. I've reviewed your IA statement. Thorne continued. You were honest. You admitted Miller was the aggressor. You admitted you suggested calling a supervisor. That took courage. Now, I'm going to offer you a way out. He slid a document across the table. It was a settlement agreement. We are prepared to drop you from the civil lawsuit entirely. We will release you from all liability. You walk away from this, financially, scot-free. Kowalski looked up, his eyes filled with suspicion. What's the catch? The catch, Thorne said, leaning forward, is that you have to agree to testify truthfully at the trial. You will get on the witness stand, under oath, and you will tell the jury exactly what you saw. You will tell them about Miller's temper. You will tell them about his history of aggressive behavior. You will tell them that Ben Carter did nothing to provoke the assault. You will tell them everything. Kowalski's lawyer read the agreement carefully. It was airtight. It was a lifeline. They'll call me a rat, Kowalski whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I'll never be able to work as a cop again, anywhere. Your career was over the moment Miller put those handcuffs on Ben Carter, Thorne said, his voice softening with a hint of empathy. This isn't about saving your career anymore. It's about saving your future. It's about choosing which side of the truth you want to be on. You can go down with a liar like Dean Miller, or you can stand up and help a good man get the justice he deserves. He gave Kowalski a moment to process it. Think about it, Frank. This is your chance to make it right. Not just for Ben Carter, but for yourself. You walk out of that courtroom with your head held high, knowing you finally did the right thing. For Frank Kowalski, the choice was agonizing but clear. The blue wall of silence was a fortress that protected its own, but it offered no mercy to those who were cast out. He was already outside the walls. He picked up a pen and signed the agreement. With that signature, Marcus Thorne had secured his most powerful weapon. The testimony of a police officer against his own partner was devastatingly effective in court. It shattered the narrative that this was just a case of one bad apple. It proved that the problem was known, that it was witnessed, and that it was tolerated. The city's legal team had no idea that their star witness had just become the prosecution's. They were still preparing for a trial, unaware that their entire defense had just been gutted from the inside out. Armed with Miller's disastrous deposition and a signed cooperation agreement from Kowalski, Marcus Thorne decided it was time to put the city's feet to the fire. He requested a formal settlement conference with the city's legal team. A final, mandatory step before proceeding to trial. The meeting took place in a federal judge's chambers. The atmosphere was thick with tension. On one side sat Marcus Thorne and Ben Carter, calm and resolute. On the other side sat Gerald Finney and a team of 3 other city attorneys, their faces grim. Judge Marion Hayes, a formidable jurist with little patience for games, presided over the meeting. Mr. Thorne, Mr. Finney, the judge began. I have reviewed the preliminary filings in this case. I have seen the video. I have read excerpts from the depositions. Frankly, Mr. Finney, I'm not sure why we're here. The liability on the part of the city seems, to put it mildly, unequivocal. What is your settlement offer? Finney, looking uncomfortable, cleared his throat. Your Honor, while the video is certainly challenging, we believe there are mitigating circumstances. Officer Miller was working to secure a route for a state senator, a matter of public safety. Judge Hayes held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Counsel, do not waste my time. The only matter of public safety in that video was the man dying in the back of the ambulance. Let's get to the numbers. Mr. Thorne, what is your demand? Your Honor, Thorne said, his voice steady. Given the egregious nature of the officer's conduct, the physical and emotional damages to my client, the clear pattern of negligence in supervision by the city, and the need for significant punitive damages to ensure this never happens again. We are demanding a settlement of $10 million. A visible shock went through the city's legal team. Finney's face paled. He had been authorized to go as high as $2 million, a figure he thought was astronomical. $10 million was unthinkable. "That's an absurd figure, Your Honor," Finney stammered. "It's completely out of line with precedent. We are a city with a budget, not a Fortune 500 company." "Your budget is not Mr. Carter's problem," Thorne retorted coolly. "Perhaps you should have considered it before you allowed an officer with 6 prior excessive force complaints to remain on the street. This isn't just about compensating, Ben. It's about the bully tax. You let a bully run wild with a badge and a gun, and now the taxpayers have to pay for the damage." Judge Hayes looked at Finney. "Counsel, Mr. Thorne's point about the prior complaints is a powerful one for a jury. I would advise you to consider it carefully. What is your counteroffer?" After a hurried, whispered conference with his team, Finney came back with his number. "The city is prepared to offer Mr. Carter $1.5 million, with no admission of wrongdoing." Marcus Thorne laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but it was filled with such genuine amusement and contempt that it made everyone in the room flinch. $1.5 million? For a case that will likely result in a federal consent decree over your police department? For a case where your lead defendant perjured himself in his deposition and his own partner is going to testify against him? Finney's head snapped up. "What are you talking about? Officer Kowalski is our witness." Thorne smiled, a slow, predatory grin. "Not anymore." He slid a copy of the signed cooperation agreement across the table. "Officer Kowalski will be my first witness. He will testify, under oath, about Miller's long-standing pattern of aggression and his lies regarding this incident. So, I will ask you again. Do you want to reconsider your offer?" Finney stared at the document, the color draining from his face. He had been completely blindsided. The city's entire strategy had been to discredit Ben Carter and hope Kowalski would remain silent or vague. Now, that strategy was in ashes. Despite this devastating revelation, Finney was trapped. The city council had given him a hard cap. Politically, they couldn't stomach the idea of a $10 million settlement. They feared it would set a precedent, opening the floodgates for more lawsuits. They would rather take the risk, gamble on the unpredictability of a jury, than agree to such a massive payout. It was a politically motivated decision, not a legally sound one. "The city's final offer is $2 million, Finney said, his voice hollow. Marcus Thorne slowly stood up, gathering his papers. "Then we are at an impasse. Your Honor, we are ready for trial." He turned to Finney. "You have made a grave mistake. You had a chance to contain this, to pay the $10 million and begin the process of healing. Instead, you've chosen to roll the dice. After a jury hears the evidence, after they see these videos and listen to Officer Kowalski, they are not going to give my client $10 million. They are going to give him much, much more, and every penny of it will be your fault." He and Ben Carter walked out of the chambers, leaving the city's legal team sitting in stunned silence. They had just turned down a $10 million deal on what was now a completely indefensible case. It wasn't a legal strategy. It was an act of political desperation. And it was a gamble that was about to cost the city of Charleston dearly. The courtroom was packed. The trial of Carter versus City of Charleston. Et al-Bali had become the biggest media event in the city's recent history. Every seat was filled with reporters, legal analysts, and members of the public. Ben Carter sat at the plaintiff's table next to Marcus Thorne, his face composed, his posture straight. At the defense table, Dean Miller sat beside Gerald Finney, looking sullen and avoiding eye contact with everyone. The first few days of the trial were a methodical presentation of the undisputed facts. Thorne called the 911 dispatcher who took the original call, establishing the critical nature of the medical emergency. He called the emergency room doctor who treated Frank, the construction worker, who testified that any further delay in treatment would have likely been fatal. But the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the third witness Thorne called to the stand, Klaus Richter, the German tourist. Richter, who had flown back to the United States at the trial's expense, was a quiet, unassuming man in his late 50s. He explained through a German interpreter that he had started filming because he was shocked by the officer's aggressive tone. "In my country," Richter said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "The police and the paramedics, they work together. They help each other. I have never seen a police officer shout at a medical worker who is trying to save someone. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. So I recorded it." Thorne then moved to have the video entered into evidence. "Your Honor, we would like to play Plaintiff's Exhibit A for the jury." The courtroom lights dimmed slightly, and the large screens that had been set up for the jury flickered to life. The viral video, the one seen by millions around the world, began to play. The audio filled the silent courtroom. The jury was captivated. They leaned forward in their seats, their faces a mixture of concentration and disbelief. They heard Miller's sharp, demanding voice. They heard Ben's calm, professional refusal. They saw Miller escalate the situation, his body language becoming more aggressive with each passing second. They heard his insult, "Glorified taxi driver." A few jurors winced. One, a middle-aged woman who worked as a school nurse, shook her head almost imperceptibly. Then came the moment of the arrest. The video clearly showed Miller grabbing Ben, who was making no threatening moves, and violently pulling him from the ambulance. The sound of the patient's medical alarms, a frantic, high-pitched shriek, became the soundtrack to the scene. The jury saw Ben being shoved against the ambulance, the handcuffs clicking shut. They saw Maria Sanchez's desperate face in the background. When the video ended, the courtroom was utterly silent for a long moment. The images hung in the air, more powerful than any testimony could ever be. The jury had not just been told what happened. They had witnessed it. They had seen the abuse of power with their own eyes. Thorne let the silence sit, allowing the impact of the video to sink in before he spoke. "Mr. Richter, after you stopped recording, what did you do?" "I uploaded the video," Richter said simply. "I felt people needed to see what I saw, that this was not right." "Thank you, sir. No further questions," Thorne said. Gerald Finney, the city's attorney, knew he was in trouble. He had to try and mitigate the damage. He stood up to cross-examine the tourist. "Mr. Richter," Finney began, "you're not a law enforcement expert, are you?" "No, I am an engineer," Richter replied. "So you don't know American police procedures? You don't know what an officer is trained to do when an order is disobeyed?" Richter paused for a moment, then looked directly at the jury. "I do not need to be an expert to know the difference between right and wrong. I saw a man trying to save a life, and another man arresting him for it. It is that simple." The answer was devastating. Finney had tried to frame the issue in terms of procedure and training, but Richter had brought it back to fundamental morality. The jury's faces showed that they agreed with him. Finney, seeing he had lost the point, quickly finished. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Klaus Richter stepped down from the witness stand, a quiet murmur went through the courtroom. Marcus Thorne had just laid the cornerstone of his case, not with legal arguments, but with a simple, undeniable piece of visual evidence. What the city's lawyers failed to grasp was that the trial wasn't just about what happened on that street. It was about what the jury saw happen, and they had just seen, with perfect clarity, a hero being treated like a criminal. The emotional tide of the trial had turned decisively, and it was only the beginning. The day after the jury saw the video, Marcus Thorne called his next witness, Dr. Alana Reed, the chief of emergency medicine at University Hospital and a leading expert on pre-hospital trauma care. Dr. Reed, an articulate and authoritative woman in her 50s, explained in clear, simple terms the medical science behind heat stroke and cardiac distress. When a patient is in the state Mr. Frank was in... Dr. Reed explained, gesturing to a medical chart. They are on a razor's edge. Their cardiovascular system is unstable. Any sudden movement, any jostling, can trigger a fatal arrhythmia. The paramedics' decision to stabilize him on the scene before transport was not just correct, it was the only medically responsible course of action. Thorne then asked the critical question. Dr. Reed, in your expert medical opinion, what would have been the likely outcome if EMT Carter had obeyed Officer Miller's order and immediately driven the ambulance? Doctor. Reed's answer was chillingly direct. The patient would have almost certainly gone into full cardiac arrest, given the instability shown on his EKG. His chances of being successfully resuscitated in a moving vehicle would have been slim to none. In my opinion, moving the ambulance at that moment would have been tantamount to a death sentence. The words hung in the air. A death sentence. The jury absorbed the weight of the testimony. The case was no longer about obstruction. It was about a life that was nearly lost due to one officer's impatience. Finally, it was time for Ben Carter to take the stand. Dressed in a simple dark suit, he was the picture of calm professionalism. He recounted the events of that day, his voice steady and factual. He explained his training, his duty, and his thought process. When Officer Miller ordered me to move, Ben testified, I had to make a choice. It wasn't a choice between obeying an officer and disobeying him. It was a choice between my patient's life and an officer's convenience. For any paramedic, that's not a choice at all. You always choose the patient. During cross-examination, Gerald Finney tried to paint Ben as an arrogant rule breaker. Mr. Carter, you believe your judgment is superior to that of a sworn police officer? Ben's reply was simple and powerful. In a medical emergency, yes. That is what I am trained for. Just as I would defer to his judgment in a police matter, he should have deferred to mine in a medical one. Finney could find no cracks in his composure, no inconsistencies in his story. Ben was an unshakable witness. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. The defense called its primary witness, Dean Miller. Miller took the stand, his face a tight mask of resentment. From the moment Finney began questioning him, it was a disaster. He came across as defensive, arrogant, and utterly lacking in remorse. He stuck to the fabricated story from his report, a story the jury had already seen contradicted by the video evidence. The paramedic was belligerent, Miller insisted. He was escalating the situation. When it was Thorne's turn to cross-examine, he dismantled Miller with surgical precision, using the transcript from the deposition as his roadmap. Mr. Miller, you testified that Mr. Carter was the aggressor. Thorne began. Yet, on your own body camera, we hear you insulting him, calling him a glorified taxi driver. Was that part of your de-escalation training? It was a tense situation. Miller grumbled. Was it also part of your training to lie in your official report? Mr. Miller? Thorne shot back, his voice like ice. You omitted that comment from your report, didn't you? You also omitted that your partner suggested calling a supervisor. Why is that? Miller floundered, contradicting himself, his face growing redder with each question. I don't recall. It didn't seem important. It didn't seem important that you were the one escalating the conflict. It didn't seem important that you ignored a chance to let a supervisor handle it. Thorne stepped closer to the witness box. The truth is, you lost your temper because a paramedic told you no. Isn't that right? Your pride was hurt, so you assaulted him and arrested him on false charges. Isn't that what really happened? No, that's not true, Miller shouted, pointing a finger at Thorne. You're twisting everything. The outburst was the final nail in his coffin. The jury saw him for exactly what he was, an angry, dishonest man trying to escape the consequences of his own actions. His credibility was not just damaged, it was utterly annihilated. Thorne glanced at the jury, then back at Miller. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor. As Dean Miller stepped down from the stand, a disgraced figure, the contrast between the two men was stark and undeniable. The jury had seen the calm, dedicated hero and the arrogant, volatile bully. The city's gamble of going to trial had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. They hadn't just failed to defend their case, they had proven Marcus Thorne's for him. After the closing arguments, in which Marcus Thorne masterfully replayed key moments from the videos and highlighted the stark contrast between Ben Carter's calm integrity and Dean Miller's angry deceit, the case was handed over to the jury. Gerald Finney's closing argument was weak and unfocused, a desperate attempt to argue that Miller had made a mistake in judgment under pressure. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that his heart wasn't in it. Legal analysts predicted the jury would deliberate for at least a day or two. Given the complexity of the civil claims against the city, they were wrong. After just 4 hours, a note was passed to the bailiff. The jury had reached a verdict. The news spread through the courthouse like a shockwave. Ben Carter and Marcus Thorne returned to the courtroom, their expressions unreadable. Dean Miller was not present. He had been advised by his new criminal defense attorney to stay away. The city's legal team filed in, their faces ashen. The jury box was filled, and the foreman, a retired postal worker, held a piece of paper in his hand. He avoided looking at the defense table. In the matter of Carter versus Miller, the court clerk began, her voice echoing in the silent room. On the count of assault. How do you find? The foreman stood. We find for the plaintiff, Ben Carter. On the count of battery. How do you find? We find for the plaintiff, Ben Carter. On the count of false arrest, how do you find? We find for the plaintiff, Ben Carter. The litany continued, count after count. The verdict was the same. Unlawful detention, malicious prosecution. They found Miller liable on every single charge. Then came the claims against the city. On the count of negligent hiring and supervision against the city of Charleston, how do you find? We find for the plaintiff, Ben Carter. The gasp from the city's lawyers was audible. The jury had agreed that this was not just one bad officer, it was a systemic failure. Finally, the clerk came to the damages. What compensatory damages do you award to the plaintiff, Ben Carter, for his physical and emotional suffering? The foreman cleared his throat. We award the plaintiff $1.2 million. This sum alone was significant, but it was the next question that held everyone breathless. And what punitive damages do you award to the plaintiff, Ben Carter, to be paid by the defendant, the city of Charleston? Punitive damages were not about compensation. They were about punishment, designed to be a deterrent so significant that it would force institutional change. Marcus Thorne had asked for a historic amount, and the city had gambled that no jury would ever award it. The foreman looked directly at the city's attorneys, his expression stern. We award the plaintiff punitive damages in the amount of $15 million. The courtroom erupted. A wave of gasps and frantic whispers swept through the gallery. $15 million in punitive damages, on top of the $1.2 million in compensatory damages, a total of $16.2 million. It was one of the largest verdicts ever handed down against a municipality in the state's history. Ben Carter sat perfectly still, his eyes closed for a brief moment. It wasn't about the money. It was the validation. It was the dozen strangers on the jury seeing the truth and affirming that what happened to him was wrong, that his duty mattered, and that his integrity had been worth the fight. Marcus Thorne placed a hand on his shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. Gerald Finney and his team sat stunned, as if a physical blow had landed. Their gamble, their politically motivated decision to reject a $10 million settlement, had just cost the city an additional $6.2 million, not to mention the millions spent on a trial they were destined to lose. They had not only lost the case, they had been publicly humiliated. The verdict was more than just a legal decision. It was a message. It was a roar from the citizens of Charleston, delivered through their jury, that they would no longer tolerate abuses of power, that they valued the lives of their citizens over the pride of a police officer, and that they demanded accountability not just from the individual, but from the system that created and protected him. The city had rolled the dice, and the jury had made them pay a price that would be remembered for generations. The fallout from the verdict was swift and severe. The staggering $16.2 million judgment sent shockwaves through the city government. The city council was forced to hold an emergency session to approve borrowing bonds to pay the verdict, a debt that would impact the city's finances for years to come. The political careers of the mayor and the city council members who had pushed to reject the settlement were effectively over for Dean Miller. The civil verdict was just the beginning of his personal and professional annihilation. 2 weeks after the trial, the district attorney, emboldened by the public outcry and the mountain of evidence, filed criminal charges against him, assault under color of authority and perjury for his lies during the deposition. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked, ensuring he would never wear a badge again, anywhere in the country. He eventually took a plea deal to avoid prison time, receiving 5 years of probation, a felony conviction that would follow him for the rest of his life, and court-mandated anger management therapy. The man who had once wielded absolute authority on a city street was now a convicted felon, unemployable and disgraced. The Charleston Police Department was forced into a federal consent decree with the Department of Justice, which had launched its own investigation following the verdict. The decree mandated a complete overhaul of their use of force policies, bias training, and, most importantly, the creation of an independent civilian oversight board with the power to investigate and recommend discipline for officer misconduct. The blue wall of silence was officially dismantled by federal mandate. Police Chief Donovan was forced into an early retirement. Ben Carter, with the guidance of Marcus Thorne, used a portion of the settlement to establish a foundation dedicated to providing legal support for first responders who face retaliation for upholding their ethical oaths. He continued to work as a paramedic, not because he needed the money, but because it was who he was. When he walked into a scene, he was treated with a new level of respect by the police officers he worked alongside. His name had become a byword for integrity within the city's emergency services community. He was the quiet hero who had stood his ground and, in doing so, had changed everything. His partner, Maria Sanchez, became a leading voice in the department for better interagency training. Frank Kowalski resigned from the police force and moved his family out of state, finding peace in a quiet life away from the pressures and moral compromises he could no longer endure. As time passed and the headlines faded, Ben often found himself reflecting on the single moment that had altered the course of so many lives. What drove a man like Dean Miller to throw everything away over a simple refusal? It wasn't just about a motorcade. It was about a fragile ego wrapped in the armor of a uniform. Miller's authority was the core of his identity. And when Ben challenged it, not with aggression, but with the quiet, immovable logic of his duty, it felt like a personal attack. Miller saw a challenge not to his uniform, but to his very self-worth. His rage was the desperate lashing out of a man who needed the world to bend to his will because he lacked the internal strength to navigate a world that wouldn't. His actions were not a product of training, but of a deep-seated insecurity that his badge could no longer hide. Ben sometimes wondered what might have been. What if he had been wearing a body camera that day? Would Miller have been so bold, knowing his every word and action was being recorded for a supervisor? What if Sergeant Rostova hadn't arrived when she did, a competent authority in a sea of chaos? Perhaps the story would have ended differently, with Ben in a jail cell and Frank, the patient, in a morgue. It was a sobering reminder that justice often hinges on chance, the presence of a tourist with a camera, the arrival of a good supervisor, the courage of a partner to finally tell the truth, to protect himself and others better. The only answer was the one he had already found: unwavering adherence to one's oath, documented by technology and supported by a system that values accountability over silence. Ultimately, the story of the arrest on that sun-scorched street became a modern parable. It serves as a powerful reminder that true authority is not derived from a badge or a uniform, but from the moral courage to do the right thing, especially when it is difficult. It teaches us that a single act of integrity can be a powerful catalyst for change, exposing the cracks in a flawed system and forcing a long overdue reckoning. It is a testament to the fact that in the battle between ego and duty, the arc of the moral universe, however long, eventually bends toward justice. What would you have done in Ben's position? Have you ever witnessed a professional stand up for what's right, even at great personal risk? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please share it with others who believe in the power of courage and accountability.